Okay, today we're going to talk about Chapter 27, Lesson 3. It's titled On the Home Front. So, we're going to be talking about World War II and the U.S. involvement. So, first of all, we already talked about last time how we had already started building up our military in preparation, assuming that, we may have to go to war. So, once we did go to war, we continued that. About 15 million more soldiers went to war either voluntarily or through the draft. They went through about 6 weeks of training, and they were issued uniforms, right, and T-shirts and everything. And to keep track of it, they stamped the items government issue, meaning like it's not your property, it's the government's property, right? And so soldiers during this time started to be called GIs because they had the GI stamp on their clothing. So you may have heard of like GI Joe, and maybe you didn't know why they called that. That's why. Okay. Also, women did join the military during this time period. Now, they were not allowed to fight, so they had non-combat roles. However, they were much more prevalent, very important. Um, of course, they did things at the time like that women, it was thought acceptable, right? Nurses or a lot of office support staff. They did let some women pilots, although these women, again, they couldn't go in combat. So they would do, there's a group called the WASPs. They're Women's Air Force Service Pilots, and they would do things like fly planes from a base for repair, or they could help out. They could be a co-pilot on night missions, or like on weather planes they were allowed to do. So things that were like less dangerous, although some did still get injured or killed, of course, because they're involved. So we start to see that. Also, the economy shifts to a wartime economy, like we've talked about in World War One. You see here the National War Labor Board again. Remember, we talked about that previously, that they'd want to make sure that there's no labor disputes during this time because it's really important to put out the war effort. Also, the War Production Board, which is helping all the companies shift to making things for the war. So, for example, automakers who already deal with metal and making have all the parts that you would basically need, they can shift to like Jeeps or tanks or planes. And that happens during wartime. And actually, I don't know if you've noticed, but during COVID, also they started having companies shift to making things they needed to deal with the pandemic. Okay, so that can happen during crises. All right, and funding the war, we spent more money on this war, way more than on the World War One. And to get the money to pay for the war, one of the things they did was they made the Revenue Act of 1942, which raised business taxes, and the big thing, most Americans have to pay an income tax. And for the first time, that income tax now would be withheld from your paycheck. And we, of course, still do that today. Okay, also another way to make money for the war was war bonds. And we've talked about war bonds before. Basically, it is encouraging Americans, regular civilians, right, to buy in. So let's say they bought a $75 bond, and the government can use your $75 right now for the war effort, and they promise that they will pay you back with interest in the future. So maybe you expect to get like $100 in the future. Okay, so that was big. So you can see that poster there trying to like tug on people's patriotism. Many people thought you should do like about 10% of your income if you could, things like that. Or like to appease your guilt if you're not going to fight, right? If you can't fight, then you should give us money to help the effort. Okay, at home, anyone who didn't go to war, you were still very affected by the war. Not only is your family member maybe gone, right, and maybe died, but you have a harder time during wars. Um, often during wars, they need the food and other, things like gas and things like that for the soldiers. So they ask the people at home not to use as much. Okay, so the same thing happened in previous wars. So in the World War II, you can see there's a picture up there. They had ration stamps. So to ration something right is to not let people buy too much of something that's in a short supply. So they had these stamps that if you wanted to buy these rationed items like gas or tires or shoes or coffee or meat or sugar, things that were hard to get, you had to, give one of these stamps. And so you could only buy that much. Okay. Also, they worked on, because some things were in short supply, encouraging people to kind of like these victory gardens, right? Grow your own vegetables, do what you can do at home, and you can help minimize, right, the scarcity of some things. Kids were encouraged to collect scrap metal, any metals they find, to help with so they could go and deposit those in places that can be reused. Um, and then people, men, sometimes women, but a lot of times men who are not fighting would volunteer as some kind of civil defense job, like a air raid warden, trying to encourage people to like follow the rules at home. And so sometimes they were volunteer spotters, especially if you were on a coastal city, you're worried about attack, right? Like after Pearl Harbor, they know it can happen, right? And so they would have people who go out with their binoculars at night looking to warn people if they see enemy aircraft. Also, they'd have people who were making sure people are following the blackouts on these coastal cities. The idea was that you don't want to have a lot of lights on because it's like a beacon kind of for the enemy pilots to know where to bomb, right? So they would have these times where you'd have to black out your curtains, right? You can see the picture there. You'd put up extra dark curtains and you'd try not to use many lights. And it got really specific. Like you shouldn't be like outside smoking, and you should, because you could see the light. And if they call like a warning or whatever, then everyone should pull over and turn off their lights in their car. They really tried to get people to minimize the lights in those coastal cities. Also, women, there was a lot of need for women to work in the assembly lines, right? All these factory jobs, and a lot of the men are off fighting, so the women go and maybe a lot of them join the workforce for the very first time, and they're doing these jobs, that are different for them, right? They're more physical, putting together planes and things. So that's where the Rosie the Riveter famous poster there. It was an advertisement trying to get women to like come do these industry jobs, and they did. And after the war, of course, then the men wanted the jobs back, and the women stopped working a lot for the most part. But it does start, the trend, and it shows that women are capable, things like that. Okay, and then minorities. So every time, often history books don't tell you about what's going on. So this book does try to explain like what's happening with minorities. So of course we see some improvement during the 40s here, 1940s, but of course there's still a lot of unfortunate, you know, people are not very open still. So you start to see a trend, a little bit of a change. So, for example, African Americans, in the beginning of the war, they were put in very low jobs. They could only be like, um, you know, cleaning up and doing mechanical things. They weren't allowed to go even fight because they thought that like white men wouldn't trust them to be their um, fighting with them. Then that starts to change, and they start letting them maybe train together. And then finally, in 1944, they're actually allowed to fight in combat assignments. Um, the Tuskegee Airmen, oh, it looks like I put a capital there. Tuskegee Airmen is the picture. It's one of the famous fighting pilots um, that they flew missions, and they got a lot of, of course, it was segregated, right? All African American. Um, my grandfather actually was a pilot in World War II, and I remember him saying, like, he was a typical man at the time, right? That didn't quite understand African Americans and thought they were like beneath him. But he said, one day his plane um, was hit, and he probably would not have made it back safely without one of these Tuskegee airmen um, like helped like lead him back. So he flew next to him so he would know the way back because his instruments were ruined or whatever. And so after that, he kind of changed his tune, right? And he thought that they were like worth something. So it's a little sad to, that you have to be proven, right, that they are equal to you or just as good. But you could hear that it took that kind of for him to now think they were worth something, right? Okay, and then also at home in the workplace, you start to see a little bit of change. The Fair Employment Practices Committee is something that was passed to say that you can't discriminate in the workplace. So again, right, it's a slow process. It's starting to be talked about, but of course, there still is a lot of discrimination. All right, Native Americans, same thing. A lot of Native Americans fought and did well in the war. One group that gets a lot of notoriety is these group called the Code Talkers. I have a little video to show you, but basically, they need to have secret codes, right? Because the Japanese are really good about breaking your codes. And so they came up with this brilliant idea to recruit people from the Navajo tribe and to have a code based on the Navajo language. And the Japanese were never able to break this code because, right, they imagine like how few people actually speak Navajo. And so it was a brilliant move. And so you can see there's a picture there of some of them, giving and taking messages based in their language. So the Navajo, that was a major contribution to the war. Latinos also fought in the war, and there's a lot of good examples in the book of people who did well. One of the things I wanted to mention at home was there's something called the Bracero program, which was encouraging actually immigration from Mexico. So it is interesting, isn't it, throughout history of when we kind of need them, we encourage immigration from Mexico. But then, of course, during other times, we're like trying to push them out and say immigrants are bad. And so in this particular program during the war, right, a lot of the men are off fighting and they need more railroad workers and farmers. And so they actually encouraged immigration during this time. All right. And, but of course, still getting a lot of negativity, unfortunately. A lot of cities didn't like these people coming in and they got a lot of discrimination. Okay. All right. And then Japanese Americans. So remember, the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. So they are like enemy number one to us right now. And a lot of people started distrusting Japanese Americans, even though that they're citizens, right? And some of them are now like second generation. There was the idea that many people thought that they might be like spies and they would maybe, help the Japanese, especially they're worried about the ones on the coast, right? Like California and since it happened in Hawaii, right, they're worried about it coming to mainland attack next. And so there was a movement. They made it, first it was voluntary, and then of course not that many moved voluntarily. So then they eventually forced them to leave their homes and to move to these, what they called internment camps, which are like concentration camps basically, right? And about 100,000 families, families, I mean, we're talking kids, elderly, everyone, was forced to leave their homes and to go into these camps, a lot of them for about 3 years. So not only is that against your rights as a citizen, right? They also, a lot of them financially were hurt by this. If you're gone for 3 years, imagine like some places, if you didn't pay your taxes, so they took your business or your home, or things were broken into and stolen while you were gone, and so a lot of people were hurt financially. Besides, also like your feelings getting hurt, right? Like a lot of these Japanese Americans, they feel patriotic. Some of them fought in the war, right? Or have, other family members fighting, and yet they're put in these camps. So I have a video about that, but it's a really sad time. There was a famous case. There was this man, Korematsu, he refused to go. And his case went all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1944. And they finally said, nope, it's fine. They did this. It's wartime, and they upheld it and they said it was okay. Now, of course, over the years, people realized how wrong it was. And finally, in 1988, the U.S. apologized, and Congress said, any survivors, of the camps, will give you $20,000 each to try to make amends. But of course, look how much, 40 years later, and, little too late, right? Miss Fujita, the new counselor, her dad, I know, was actually born in one of these camps. So that's interesting. Okay. All right. We'll talk more about the war next time.